welcome to another very special edition of VU Sports Wired. I am Cutler Klein alongside Max Schneider and Drew Sundaram. Thank you so much as always for tuning in. As always, we have a great show for you this afternoon. It is officially baseball season and baseball season alone in terms of major college sports, and MLB opening day happened the other day. So getting that long 162 game drive to the postseason. Of course, plenty of other sports going on. But right now we're going to look at Vanderbilt Baseball. Went on the road this past weekend to Kentucky, lost the series, lost 2 out of 3 in Lexington. That's the second SEC series they've lost. They've won one, but they've lost now 2 SEC series out of their 3 that they've had so far. And guys, I wanted to ask you, a big issue surrounding this team this season has been their pitching. But, I mean, they have plenty of pitchers available. So I want to ask you guys, are there any other issues with this Vanderbilt baseball team so far this season that stick out to you other than the pitching? Or is it really just the struggling of this pitching staff that has led to this inconsistency that Vanderbilt has had this season?
Yeah, to me, when you're looking at the problem that Vanderbilt baseball has right now, it is that inconsistency in pitching. Let's take a look at the 2 losses they had in the series against Kentucky. Friday night, they lost 10-3. And Patrick Raby gave up a 5-run second inning. Saturday, they lost 7-4. And Kyle Wright, the slated top 5 pick for Vanderbilt in the draft before the season started, gave up a 5-run third inning. And literally, last week on the show, we were talking about Vanderbilt baseball. We were talking about how Darren Kendall's back and how the batting has picked up and how we're seeing a lot of run production. But at the end of the day, you can only score so much. I mean, Infante's hitting 364. Kendall's hitting 323, and Toffee's hitting 318. And these are the top 3 batters, and they're doing really, really well for Vanderbilt. But you're seeing this inconsistency in pitching. And for a batter, it's really hard to go up to bat when you're looking at the scoreboard and you're down 7 or you're down 5, and that difference has come in the matter of a single inning. And a lot of the things that you've seen with Vanderbilt pitchers, too, is they'll be really great for 5 or 6 innings. And then all of a sudden, this one inning, they fall apart. I don't know if it's lack of composure. I don't know if it's lack of focus. But, I mean, the 5-run innings are just really unacceptable from a pitching standpoint. And it's a lot harder for these batters when they're getting up and they're seeing that big hole. So I think that the pitching's definitely the big issue right now.
Yeah, and I think it's a little confusing because you look at the pitching numbers and you see guys like Drake Fellows, Chandler, Day, Patrick Raby, all of them have fantastic numbers. But the number at the top is Kyle Wright. And you see that Kyle Wright has a 5.59 ERA. He's 1-4. I mean, this is a guy who coming into the season was projected to be a top 5 pick, arguably the best pitcher in all of college baseball, and he's not pitching like that. So right off the bat, you see almost every Friday, Vanderbilt's behind in the series because he's not pitching to his potential. And so I think inconsistency is a huge issue. You see on Saturdays, Vanderbilt will score 17 runs in a game, and then they'll face a Sunday starter, a guy who's supposed to be worse than that, and put up 3 or 4 runs in a game. So the offense is there because any team that's putting up 17 points, and they've done it a few times this season, obviously has that offensive firepower. It's just on a game-in and game-out basis. And when you look at the pitching, I think Tim Corbin's still trying to figure out his bullpen. I mean, he's got guys coming in and out. He threw Jackson Gillis for an inning yesterday. Gillis had struggled a little bit earlier in the season. Reed Hayes has kind of honed in on that closer spot. But you see a lot of turnover with the bullpen, and I think that if you can get these pitchers, and if Kyle Wright gets on track, and he figures to do so, he's a much better pitcher than this, you figure he'll start to improve. But it really boils down to the pitching, and especially the starting pitching, because you have to give your bullpen a chance.
You mentioned Kyle Wright. He was a projected top 5 pick, and he hasn't lived up quite to that hype this season. And I'm wondering how much of Vanderbilt's pitching struggles have been a trickle-down effect from that. Max, you kind of touched on that a little bit. So I'm thinking about a team, I'm just going to throw a random MLB team out there, the New York Yankees. Little bias on my part. Yeah, you have a guy like Masahiro Tanaka, who's supposed to be their ace, their lead starter. And a lot of times he tends to struggle, and I feel like that has a trickle-down effect on the rest of the staff because if your top guy is not performing, then what else can you do? Who can? If it's your top guy not going to do it, then who is going to do it? Who can you rely on? So I'm wondering, in Vanderbilt's case, is Kyle Wright's inconsistency having a trickle-down effect on the rest of the pitching staff, especially in terms of starters?
I mean, we talked about it at the beginning of the year. Like, when you're looking at pitchers, Kyle Wright's your guy. When you're looking at batting, when you're looking at the other aspects of Vanderbilt baseball, Kendall, that's your guy. But what's really interesting is that you haven't seen this trickle-down effect that you're talking about. Because, again, the other pitchers on the staff are having pretty good outings, pretty good ERAs. So you really don't see that trickle-down effect. And I think that a lot of what we've fallen into is that LeBron James trap, the LeBron James mentality that he's our ace, he's going to turn it on at some point. And you haven't seen that so far, but a lot of people aren't hitting the panic button just because we are expecting him to turn it on at some point.
Yeah, the thing I'd like to see with this team is they're not winning close games. And I think that trickle-down effect has a little bit of an effect when you get into the later innings of games and the games are still close. Vanderbilt expects coming into the season, when Kyle Wright pitches, that they should win those games. And a lot of those games won't be that close. You've seen Vanderbilt win a couple 11-0, 10-0, 17-4 games. Those are how they get their wins. They outright dominate the opponent. But when Kyle Wright's been pitching and in other close games, they've struggled. They've lost most of those close games. So it is a little bit of that trickle-down effect because when you get to the bullpen, Tim Corbin's got to put guys in the game that he knows can throw shutout innings. And those have been few and far between in the middle and late innings of these games. So it's all dependent in these starts on getting quality starts out of your pitchers and minimizing the impact that your bullpen has to pick up on this game.
I will say, getting closer to the postseason, that does become a lot more important. Getting this really good start to the weekend and making sure that you have that pitcher that can kind of carry the tempo and carry the swagger and the vibe of the team that far. So that's something you want to see shirt up for sure.
I mean, if you look at Vanderbilt teams of the past, their starting pitching has been the bedrock of how this team has been built. If you go far back as 10 years ago, David Price was the ace of that staff. You had guys like Casey Weathers, Sonny Gray, and more recently Carson Fulmer was the key figure on that pitching staff. Do you think, for Wright, looking at it from Wright's perspective, does Vanderbilt's season almost kind of hinge on whether or not he can get it together? Because, like I mentioned, Vanderbilt's skilled, incredible teams of the past have relied on that ace, have had that one pitcher that has really been the key for them. Does Vanderbilt's future in this season kind of rest on Kyle Wright's shoulders?
Yeah, I feel like a little bit it does, and it's always hard to put, and especially in a sport like baseball, it's always hard to put so much onus on one guy to kind of pick up the slack. But especially when you get into these late playoffs and these double elimination formats, it's crucial to win these opening games. And Kyle Wright's going to be that guy. It doesn't matter how badly he pitches. You know that Tim Corbin's going to trot him out on Fridays or on the first games of these tournaments and expect him to be that guy and get the job done. And so it kind of does depend on Kyle Wright being able to regain his composure. And I think that's something he'll be able to do. He's been a great pitcher for the school for 2 years, and I think he'll be able to pick that slack up. But a lot of it does depend on pitching, and it's always down to pitching when you get to the postseason, and especially your number one starter. He's got to be that guy.
Yeah, I'd say that it does rest on Kyle Wright's shoulders, but less so because he is a pitcher. And the fact is, he's pitching with a 5.59 ERA right now. Like, as a Vandy baseball fan, you know the number's going to get lower. So you don't necessarily need him to be the lead pitcher, but you need him to improve. You need him to be that figure in the locker room. And you know that number's going to improve eventually. But because he is a pitcher, I mean, he's going out there once every 4 nights. So you need him to improve, but you don't really need him to be that lead face, in my opinion.
Well, SEC baseball moves on. Vanderbilt in the thick of conference play. Speaking of pitching, one guy on Vanderbilt's staff that we talked about last week on our show when he almost had a no-hitter at First Tennessee Park is Chandler Day, a sophomore, who last night was able to shut out UT Martin 11-0. Of course, he didn't play the entire game, but he still had a stellar outing, another stellar start for him. And he's been a guy that has not really gotten a lot of attention this year, aside from that no-hitter. And he's starting to pick up his play a little bit. He hasn't gotten, big-time starts. It's mostly been these Tuesday out-of-conference games that you're seeing. So do you think that Day deserves more consideration, more recognition for his efforts? Do you think he should be rewarded with some more weekend starts?
I wouldn't say necessarily that he should be rewarded with some more weekend starts, and that's only because who is he going to replace out of these 3 pitchers? We just talked about Kyle Wright. Tim Corbin's not moving Kyle Wright out of that number 1 spot. He's just too good, too talented of a pitcher. He's the leader of this team. He's not going to move him down. And when you look at the 2 other guys, Drake Fellows and Patrick Raby, both have been excellent. They both have lower ERAs than Chandler Day, who's been great. So I just don't think that there's a spot to bump him up. What I will say, though, is now more and more in college baseball, you're starting to see like the prevalence of a Tuesday starter. And this Vanderbilt baseball team has a Tuesday game every Tuesday except for one for the remainder of the season. And in the beginning of the season, we were kind of seeing Maddox Conger pitching a couple of those games. That's Chandler Day's job from this moment on. He's going to be that Tuesday starter unless something happens to one of the top 3 starters, but he will likely get all those Tuesday starts going forward. And yes, those starts will be against teams like Tennessee Martin, but they have one of their biggest games of the season against Louisville late in the season, and that's on a Tuesday. And that's a big game for Chandler Day, who will likely pitch that Tuesday, to be able to show himself, especially going into the College World Series and regionals if they can get that far, and the SEC tournament. And so especially late in the season, he's going to be getting these starts anyway. I don't think it's a huge deal whether or not he pitches on the weekend or on these Tuesdays, but I think he should definitely be rewarded because what you're starting to see from him more is he's striking out batters. 10 strikeouts in just 6 innings on Tuesday. He's been really effective. He's been able to locate his curveball and his slider, and that fastball. We've seen a lot. The problem with Kyle Wright is a lot of those fastballs right over the middle of the plate. That's where he's getting burned. Chandler Day has really touched on those corners. He's hit the outside corner. He's hit the inside corner. And so I think if you're able to continue pitching that way, like Chandler Day is, the starts are going to come. It doesn't matter what day they're on.
Yeah, this one's a tough one for multiple reasons. And here's my pitch for moving Day. 5 wins, 0 losses. And you see him get out there. You see this increased confidence in his arm, especially in his last 2 outings. The near no-hitter was his first shutout of his career, and then having a repeat amazing performance. So you see this confidence picking up, and he's 5-0. But he is 5-0 in that Tuesday role. So I think the reigning mantra is going to be, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And I think that Chandler Day has had this success in this role, and he's comfortable as the Tuesday starter, and it's something that he's been established in right now. And if he's doing really well, I don't see a need to move him. Because if a game's on Tuesday, it's still a win no matter what. So I think that it's more important to keep him being successful than it is to move him in any way. And I think the end result, when you're looking at pitching for Tim Corbin, is to instill confidence back in Wright's arm. And I don't think you do that by potentially moving him or by potentially changing the order in regards to Wright. So I think that the best thing to do is to keep Wright in that starting role to make sure that he gets confidence back in his arm and to keep Day being successful.
One thing that's interesting to me is that usually after a performance like Day had in that near no-hitter, a lot of times this is more for the case for actual no-hitters that are completed, but the start after that is usually pretty bad, and he followed up his near no-hitter with a gem of a performance last night. But I mean, you're right. There's certainly a step up between teams like Lipscomb and UT Martin and SEC baseball schools. There just is. There's no doubt about it. So I'm wondering if Day's success may not translate very well yet, at least, to that SEC play. But is there some sort of happy medium that can be found here where Day gets those Tuesday starts, but maybe gets a little taste of pitching against those SEC opponents, getting some extended innings in those games? Maybe not starting, but maybe getting a couple innings, maybe the 6th and the 7th, or maybe if they need an extended reliever, to be able to come on and play in that role and to be able to step up against some steeper competition. Does that happy medium exist in this case?
Absolutely. And I talked about how they have a game on Tuesday almost every week. There's a week right in the middle of that season where they don't, and I think that's a great time to slip him into a weekend start, especially a Sunday start. Give Drake Fellows, who's a freshman and who's asked to have a lot on his plate early in his college baseball career. Give him a rest in that start, throw Day in there against a team like Tennessee that's a good baseball team, and give him that SEC start. I also think with the bullpen the way it is, with all this confusion in the bullpen, it's not a bad idea to give Chandler Day a couple innings in the bullpen in these SEC games, because when you get to the SEC tournament and when you get to regionals and the playoffs, these are innings that he's going to need to move to the bullpen. When you see it in the MLB playoffs, you see when they need innings, they'll go sometimes to their starters, their guys that they can rely on the most. So if Chandler Day can start to get a couple of those innings in there, I think that does represent a happy medium. And if you can get him a start in SEC play, you get him a start there, you get him a start against a top team like Louisville, that's the experience that he'll need going into the postseason.
Yeah, no, exactly. I think that happy medium becomes more likely as we get our mind on postseason play. Because, again, there is a big drop-off in the quality of competition when you're going from SEC to out of conference. So I think as Tim Corbin starts to look to solidify his lineup, looks to start thinking about postseason play more often, we can definitely see Day coming in for those innings in relief just to make sure that his arm holds up against different levels of competition.
We'll see how Day's development continues throughout the season. And lastly, to to seemingly wrap up our basketball talk for this season of the Sports Wired. This Monday was the NCAA Tournament Championship game, with North Carolina winning that one over Gonzaga, as I think a few of us probably expected out of that. It was an interesting game. I mean, granted, people are saying that the game was a disappointment, that it wasn't as fun, but I mean, you're comparing it to one of the greatest championship games of all time last season with Jenkins hitting that game-winning shot. By the way, Jenkins was in attendance and at the game behind the North Carolina bench. I found that absolutely fascinating. It was pretty fun to see that. But what were your general thoughts on the championship game? And if you want to touch on the officiating that happened a little bit, people tended to complain about that as well.
So I think it's really important to look at the makeup of UNC's team. And I'm sure this is something we've been hearing all week, but UNC won the national championship with a team that was led by juniors and seniors. And I think that just speaks to Roy Williams' prowess as a coach, that in the era of one-and-dones, you look at coaches like Coach K and Coach Calipari with 2, 3, 4 guys slated for lottery picks, and it's just a different vibe and just a different trend that we've seen in college basketball. So for Roy Williams to come in like this and to win with a team of juniors and seniors, I think it sets a different precedent for what it takes to win in the postseason in college basketball. And I think that the way that Roy Williams has done this, in the wake of the academic scandal at UNC, has made this win even more impressive. I mean, you look at a guy like Brandon Ingram, and he was a guy that played at Duke for one season, but came out and said that he chose Duke over UNC because of the possibility of sanctions at UNC. So you see Roy Williams recruiting and coaching against this academic scandal that's been over his head. And the fact that he's been able to do this, he's been able to coach up a team of juniors and seniors, the team that only has one player who's a junior who's slated to be close to a lottery pick. The fact that he's been able to do this, I think that this game speaks mostly to Roy Williams' success as a coach.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely that's true. And they just solidified something that, frankly, we already knew. Now after this UNC championship, 10 out of the past 12 teams to win the national championship did not have a one-and-done player on their roster. Only the Kentucky team with Anthony Davis and the Duke team with Jahlil Okafor, Winslow, and Tyus Jones did. So you're starting to see more and more these teams with veterans, with seniors, juniors, they're starting to win championships, and they've been doing that for a while now. What I wanted to talk about, and you touched on it, is the officiating a little bit. First of all, I'd like to tip my hat to Gonzaga. I was wrong about Gonzaga for most of this season. I said that they weren't battle-tested, that I didn't know that they were tough enough, and boy, did they show how tough they were against a UNC team that's big and was viewed as a bully coming into this game. Gonzaga really held their own, but I think one of the problems was the officiating with this game, and I think that's why the offense struggled a little bit. Yes, it was a close game, but a close game doesn't mean it was a great game, and I didn't find this to be a great game because neither team could get into a rhythm offensively. The whistles were constantly blowing, and one part that was really a problem for me was the fact that the best players weren't in this game for a large part of the first half and in crunch time. Zach Collins is a great player. He's probably going to be a big man in the NBA soon, if not next year. He's a projected lottery pick. He fouled out with 5 minutes left to go in this game and struggled even getting onto the court in the second half with all the foul trouble he had. Kennedy Meeks has been the best player for UNC this tournament. He had an outstanding game in the Final Four against Oregon and, frankly, couldn't find the floor in the first half because he got into foul trouble. He got into foul trouble in the second half. You saw almost every big man in this game had 4 fouls. At one point, I was thinking, we're going to see walk-ons on the court in a national championship game, which is why I'm starting right now the plan 6 fouls in college basketball. And I know it's bold, and the NBA does 6 fouls, and college basketball plays 8 less minutes than the NBA. But first of all, in those 8 less minutes, these players are going harder from the opening tip. You see it in the NBA that the effort isn't always there for the first 3 quarters, and there's a big drop-off from the starter to the bench. When people watch these college basketball players, nobody wants to see Stillman White come in for Joel Berry and watch him play. I'm sorry, it's just not the way it is. So I think you need to make sure that either these refs are consistent in calling less of these calls or switch to 6 fouls, keep the best players on the floor. I think in a national championship game, this really would have benefited a lot more from having the best players on the floor. Having said that, UNC, in one of their worst games of the tournament and of the season, was still able to assert their dominance because of their size down low. They really played their game. Justin Jackson was 0 for 9 from 3. It didn't matter. They were still able to win this game. So hats off to Roy Williams and this UNC team because they had a great season. And even if that last game wasn't indicative of how great their season's been, they're still coming home with a national championship.
See, here's my concern with the 6 fouls, though. And my concern with that is a concern that's been true of college sports for a while, and that's players aren't necessarily set up with college systems for success in the pros. And when you're looking at 6 fouls in a 40-minute game, I don't want that to encourage sloppy play. And when I'm looking at the foul trouble yesterday in the game, I relate that a lot more to touch fouls and meaningless fouls that the refs were calling. And granted, it was consistent both ways, but it was still a lot of things that slowed down the game, a lot of things that the fans looking at and is going, like, let them play. So I feel like when you're looking at foul trouble, it's more on the officiating end than it is on the number of fouls end. Because I'm concerned about raising the limit to 6 fouls, and all of a sudden you see sloppier defense, or it's an excuse for like a lower quality of play.
I almost feel like that the 6 fouls is kind of a Band-Aid on top of a larger issue of fouls. Because you're right. I mean, when these big men get inside the blocks, it's almost like they can't touch anybody. They can't be any bit of physical at all. You saw all the big men in this game get into serious foul trouble because the second they try to go up with something, the second they try to be the least bit physical, they touch somebody, they get an offensive foul, they get a defensive foul. It's kind of ridiculous. And kind of along that line, looking at big men in this, I think that if the NCAA officiating hadn't been as soft as it still is, I think Damian Jones from Vanderbilt would have gone much higher in the NBA draft. He would have had a much better season, would have had a much higher draft stock. But you saw a lot of times down low for Jones last season, and you see this with a lot of big men, is that they're either afraid to get aggressive, or they're too aggressive and then foul out. So it's caught between a rock and a hard place. I almost feel like the 6 fouls, yes, it's probably an easy fix to that problem, but it's not addressing the real issue in that the foul calls especially in the paint, have gone completely soft in the NCAA.
Well, I think there are 2 issues here. I think that's an issue, but I think you're coupling these issues into one thing, and I think there really are 2 issues. How often do you see 2 players, and they don't have to be big men. When Vanderbilt played Kentucky, De'Aaron Fox and Malik Monk both picked up 2 quick fouls. Yes, they were fouls. They weren't touch fouls. They picked up 2 quick fouls, and they missed the rest of the first half. And that's a nationally televised game on ESPN. How much are these people going to want to watch these games if De'Aaron Fox, the guy who everyone's looking for, is off the floor in the first 4 minutes and doesn't come back until the second half? And you're not going to be able to stop coaches from taking out their players with 2 fouls for the remainder of the first half. It's just the way it is. If you pick up 2 fouls early, you're not going to play for the remainder of the second half in most cases. And a lot of times I just see these best players, they aren't on the floor. And we saw it on the biggest stage possible in college basketball in the national championship game with this constant rotation of big men instead of letting them play, which I think also should be done, but I think giving them more fouls. Because I think if you're going to call the game this closely, and even if you're going to call the game less closely than this, you see a lot of times the best players fouling out late in games. You don't see that often in the NBA. You see it in NCAA, and it's especially difficult for teams that are in the Final Four and want to win national championships. Dylan Brooks did it in the game before against UNC. He's Pac-12 Player of the Year, one of the best players in the country. The best players need to be on the floor late in games.
What I will say, first for the big man point, is that I think in college basketball, and pretty much in sports predominantly, we see a very obvious bias towards offensive production. So, I mean, you see this in football with the secondary, and you see it in basketball with people playing down low in the paint. There's a very obvious skew towards offensive production. Because when you're looking at the market for sports, people want to see that offensive production. So when you're calling fouls this close on these really meaningless touch fouls, yes, you want to spur offensive production, but it also slows the game down like you saw in the national championship game. And my counter to the point you brought up about Fox and Monk is coach them up. Make sure they're not getting these meaningless fouls. Because, again, granted, fouls are fouls, and if they're committing these fouls, then they should be called, especially if they're obvious and especially if they're egregious. Coach them up.
Well, it seems like with fouls, the ceiling is most definitely not the roof. With that, that'll just about do it for this week's edition of VU Sports Wired. For Max Schneider and Drew Sundaram, I am Cutler Klein saying so long, and we'll see you next time.